Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Red Room Stories. I know many of you tune into these tales to help you drift off to sleep. So, before we settle in, I'd love for each of you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin.
From the time I was 11 until my late teens, I loved staying with my aunt. Her home was always filled with laughter, and I looked forward to every visit. Her house was once 3 old stone cottages that had been knocked into one. The front door opened into a large central space with big rooms on either side. The right side room led to a passageway with the kitchen on the left, stairs on the right, and a bathroom behind the stairs. Upstairs, the right side had a large open landing and one bedroom above the downstairs space. On the left, there were 2 bedrooms, one in the front and one in the back, which were connected, meaning you had to walk through the back bedroom to enter the front one. The house had been in my uncle's family for years. It was once his childhood home. I never knew exactly when the strange occurrences started, but my uncle said that things had happened in the house even when he was growing up. However, after his father passed away in the house, the activity became much stronger. Before my uncle and aunt moved in, the house was renovated, and the workmen were the first ones to get freaked out. One day, while 2 workmen were fixing up the house, one of them went to the shop to grab lunch. The other stayed upstairs painting. As he worked, he heard the front door slam shut and the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. He assumed his colleague had returned, so when the footsteps entered the room behind him, he put down his brush and turned around to speak, only to find the room empty. Without a second thought, he ran out of the house and refused to return. After that, things stayed relatively quiet until my cousin E was born. My aunt often saw shadowy figures leaning over his crib or pram. The family's pet parrot would suddenly go into fits of screaming, flapping its wings wildly at seemingly nothing. As E got older, he started talking about a lovely lady who sat with him at night and read him stories. He was around 4 years old at the time. When my aunt asked him to describe her, his description perfectly matched Arnane, who had passed away years before E was born. There were no photos of her in the house, but somehow he knew her. He also spoke about an old man who sat on the floor and played with his toys. When my uncle heard the description, he knew exactly who it was, his own father, who had also passed away in the house. One day, E walked into the kitchen looking confused. He asked my aunt, "Mommy, where did the new stairs go?" She had no idea what he meant and asked him to show her. He led her to the left-hand front room and pointed near the old fireplace. "That's where they were, Mommy, but they're gone," he said. He was only 4 or 5 years old, far too young to know the house's history. But my uncle confirmed that there had once been a staircase exactly where E had pointed. Many years ago, an elderly woman had lived in that part of the house. She had fallen down those very stairs and died. After her death, the cottages were purchased by my uncle's parents and combined into one home. When I used to stay there, my uncle's brother still lived with them, but he was often away. I slept on a camp bed in his room. At night, I saw his suit swinging on the end of the wardrobe, even though there was no breeze. Sometimes, small lights would start around the room. There were times when I saw only 1 or 2, and other times up to a dozen at once. I told my aunt and uncle what I had seen. They tried to explain it away, saying the lights were car headlights from the road below, but later they admitted they had stayed up all night in that room trying to test the theory. No car lights could reach the house due to its position. What I had seen, they finally admitted, were most likely orbs. As I got older, I stayed there less often, but I still babysat my cousins over the years. My aunt and uncle often switched the 2 front rooms around. using one as a living room and the other as a dining room, then swapping them again whenever they felt like it. When the sitting room was on the right side, the atmosphere was warm and comforting. Even though I often felt watched, it wasn't a threatening presence. However, whenever they moved the sitting room to the left side, the feeling changed completely. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and unwelcoming. Items frequently went missing, only to turn up later in the most obvious places. Every year as Christmas approached, everyone in the house would become sick. Energy levels dropped, and nasty colds and illnesses spread through the family. This happened every year without fail. This continued for years until tragedy struck. My aunt passed away suddenly at the age of 45 from a massive brain hemorrhage. By then, it had been a while since I had stayed with them, but losing her was devastating. After she passed, my uncle sold the house, and I have no idea if the new owners ever experienced anything. On the day she died, my mother had a visit from both my aunt and my nan. She told my mother, "I've been waiting for her. I have always believed that the unwelcome presence in the house was the old woman who died on the stairs. Maybe she never realized she had passed and resented the family living there. But the comforting presences, that was our nan and my uncle's father. I don't think they're in the house anymore. I truly believe they stayed just long enough to be with my aunt when it was her time. Then they finally moved on together. But the old woman, I don't think she ever left. Looking back, I wish we had helped her move on. I wish we had someone cleanse the house to help her understand that she didn't belong there anymore. But my uncle was a skeptic. He always explained away the illnesses and dismissed any talk of spirits. My aunt believed, but she didn't have the final say. Nothing was ever done. That house would have been the perfect place for a paranormal investigation. When I got a job at a software company, I had to move to a new city. Everything was unfamiliar, and I had no idea how I would manage on my own. Luckily, I made a few friends who helped me settle in, and for a while, life felt good. I thought nothing could go wrong. One of my friends, Sue, wanted to move out of her dorm and get her own place. We all tried to help her find something within her budget, but the city was expensive, and it was proving difficult. Then one day, she came to us with a pamphlet of a house that seemed too good to be true. A huge place at a price that didn't make sense. We were all surprised, but Sue was excited, so we went with her to check it out. The moment we arrived at the house, I felt something was wrong. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on my chest. It made me uneasy. Sue noticed my discomfort and told me to wait in the car. But I didn't want to make her feel bad, so I stayed. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't want us there. When we left, Sue told us she was going to buy the house. I forced a smile, but inside, I wanted to tell her to run. I knew something wasn't right, but what could I say? 2 days later, we helped her move in. It wasn't easy for me. I constantly felt like someone was watching me. The feeling was so overwhelming that I tried to avoid looking at dark corners or empty spaces. As we were leaving, one of our friends jokingly asked Sue if she would be okay living alone. To our surprise, she snapped at him, telling him she wasn't a child. It was unlike her. She had never spoken like that before. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was just stressed from the move. At first, everything seemed fine. Sue was happy, and we were happy for her. But within a few days, she started changing. She looked exhausted all the time, like she hadn't slept in days. She lost her usual energy, barely spoke, and started muttering to herself when she was alone. We grew concerned and decided to spend a night at her place to keep her company. I didn't want to go back there, but I also wanted to make sure Sue was okay. The moment she opened the door, I wanted to run. The atmosphere inside was suffocating. I could barely breathe. Something was wrong. I stood frozen at the entrance while everyone else walked inside. When I finally looked at Sue, her eyes were empty. There was something in them, something that wasn't her. I hugged her, trying to act normal, but then she whispered, "I wanted to see you for so long." I pulled back, confused. "We see each other every day," I said. She just nodded and walked off to the kitchen. Something about the way she said it sent chills down my spine. During dinner, I refused to eat, making up an excuse. I didn't want anything from that house in my body. Later, Sue asked me to sleep in her room with her. I insisted and told her I'd sleep on the couch. She didn't like that. Her expression changed just for a second, like she was angry, but I didn't care. My only priority was to get out of there alive. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet. I sat up and looked around. My friends were all sleeping soundly, but then I noticed a faint glow coming from Sue's room. I crept towards her door and peeked inside. She was sitting on the floor, talking to the wall. Her voice was low, whispering words I couldn't understand. But then I saw what she was talking to. It wasn't her shadow. Shadows don't move on their own. Something else was in the room with her. I lost it. I ran to wake my friends, but none of them woke up. I shook them, yelled at them, but they didn't even stir. That's when I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until my legs burned, until I had left that house far behind. When I finally realized where I was, I hailed a cab, but I didn't go home. I went straight to my neighbor's house. They didn't ask me anything because I was shaking, pale, barely able to speak. I asked for an idol of Lord Hanuman. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I expected calls from my friends, asking where I had gone, but no one called. I went home, got ready, and went to work. There, I asked my boss for a transfer back to my parents' city. He asked why, and I gave him a vague excuse. Anything to get away from that place. A few hours later, my friends arrived at the office. They looked tired, drained. Their faces were pale, their eyes dull. I pulled one of them aside and asked why they didn't call me. He didn't answer. Sue wasn't with them. I felt relieved but also worried. A month later, my transfer was approved. I was finally going home, but something still haunted me. Sue never came back to work. I told my friends to stay away from her house. I begged them to cut ties, and slowly they started listening. Their energy returned, their health improved. But Sue never recovered. Weeks later, we got the news that she had hanged herself. I moved back home soon after. Thankfully, nothing followed me. No nightmares, no shadows, no whispers in the dark. But that night of insanity stayed with me. I still wonder what really happened in that house, and if Sue was ever really alone. Just before I married my first wife, my parents bought a house in a small village about 35 to 40 miles south of Jackson, Mississippi. They told us we could live there and renovate it ourselves, or they would handle the work and rent it out. Since both my wife and I loved old houses and quiet country living, we decided to move in after our wedding. It was only about 15 miles from my job, making it a convenient choice. The house had an interesting history. My parents had purchased it from the heirs of an old woman who had no children. I had heard about this house before. At one point, part of it had burned down and was later rebuilt using materials from an old hotel in a nearby boomtown that had faded away when the railroad bypassed it. The original construction dated back to around 1890. When my parents bought it, the local economy was struggling, and housing demand was low. The house had been on the market for almost 2 years. They paid less for it than what a used car would cost today. Structurally, it was in decent shape. The roof and foundation were sound, but it needed a lot of work. Rewiring, replumbing, painting, new fixtures, and replacing some old window sashes. With help from skilled family members, we worked on it slowly and finished the renovation within 2 years. I was young and full of energy then, but looking back, I would never take on such a project again. Soon after we moved in, people in the village started mentioning almost casually that the old woman's nephew had died in the bathroom. It came up in conversation several times. No one made a big deal out of it, but it was strange how often it was brought up. I had a vague connection to the family. One of their relatives had been a veterinarian in my hometown. Not long after settling in, little things started happening that I couldn't explain. One evening, I took a box of frozen vegetables from our deep freezer. My parents had processed them from their garden, sealing them in plastic bags inside wax-coated cardboard boxes. I placed the box on the porch while I did a few other tasks. When I came back to start the grill, the box was no longer where I left it. It had moved about 5 feet away, sitting on the ground with the top flap neatly opened. The bag of vegetables was gone. We searched everywhere, but it was never found. Our neighbors were elderly with no children or visitors, and if it had been an animal, it was strange that the box had been carefully opened instead of dragged away. Another time, we heard a loud knock at the front door. It was clear and deliberate. My wife and I were in the bedroom, which was only about 6 feet away from the front entrance. The porch outside was made of wood, and we should have heard footsteps approaching, but there was nothing. The door itself had a large glass panel, but when we looked, there was no one there. I quickly went to open the door, but by the time I got there, whoever had knocked had vanished. There was no way someone could have knocked and then run off without making any noise. One of the strangest incidents happened in May 1986 for Mother's Day. My wife and I made a fancy spinach lasagna for our mothers. I remember using the last of the lasagna noodles from our tall glass pasta container and even grabbing a few extra from a box in the pantry to finish the dish. A few weeks later, I decided to make regular lasagna with ground beef. I expected to find a few leftover pieces in the pantry, but when I checked the pasta jar, there were noodles inside. That wasn't possible. I knew for a fact I had emptied it. I opened the jar, and at the bottom, there was a small strip of paper. When I pulled it out, I saw that it had my wife's full maiden name printed on it. It wasn't just a random piece of paper. It was a name card, the kind that comes with graduation invitations. The excess had been cut away, leaving only her name in type. This was odd because before we were married, I had asked her for one of those cards as a keepsake. But she told me she didn't have any left. If any still existed, they were buried somewhere in her mother's attic behind piles of old boxes. She had no reason to cut one up and put it inside a pasta jar. When I showed it to her, she was just as shocked as I was. She swore she had no idea how it got there and had never even touched the pasta jar. Another strange thing happened when my wife was reading a book called Ghost Story by Peter Straub. She had been reading it every night before bed, but one evening she couldn't find it. We searched everywhere in the bedroom, under the bed, in the closet, but it was gone. Days passed, and she kept mentioning that she had no idea where it had disappeared to. Then, about a week later, I walked into the bedroom and saw the book lying on the floor on my wife's side of the bed. Something else had been placed inside the book. A photographic negative. I held it up to the light and saw an image of a man in his 30s or 40s, sitting in a large chair holding an old Falstaff beer can. His clothing looked like it was from the 1960s or early 70s. The most unsettling part, the man in the photo looked remarkably like the veterinarian from my hometown, the one who had been related to the old woman who previously owned our house. I asked my wife about it, but she had never seen the negative before and swore she had no idea where it came from. These experiences weren't terrifying, but they were strange enough to make us wonder what was going on. Over time, We just accepted that the house had some kind of presence. We never felt threatened, but we knew we weren't alone. The only logical explanation was that my wife had somehow orchestrated everything as an elaborate prank. But she wasn't the type to do that. If she had wanted to mess with me, she would have done something simple, not something that required careful planning and months of setup. I don't have answers. I don't know if something in that house was trying to communicate with us or just playing tricks, but those moments stayed with me, and I've never experienced anything quite like them since.